Hi kids, my name is Sierra. Last Sunday, you were told the story of a baby named Moses who was found by an Egyptian princess in a basket floating in the river. Moses was a Hebrew who was raised in Egypt. He saw with his own eyes God's people, the Hebrews, were treated poorly. They were slaves to the Egyptians, and Moses knew something was not right.
Interesting.
Hi. Who are you and how did you get here?
I do not know how I arrived. Where am I? This is not my palace in Egypt. And what are these things?
Bruh.
That brings light and drawings? And this? I've never seen anything like this before.
These things are called electronic devices. By the way you look, I guess you wouldn't know that. For example, this is a cell phone. Not only can I send a message or call anyone, I can also take pictures with it. See?
Oh, yes, of course. I was not terrified. I knew that.
Anyways, before I was really interrupted, I was about to tell my friends here the story of Moses.
Moses? Where is Moses? I shall send my guards after him.
Whoa, slow your roll. Moses isn't around here. Hasn't been for a long time. Wait a minute. Are you that Pharaoh who didn't want to let God's people go? You are. You better be careful because something terrible is about to happen if you don't obey God's command.
God's command? I am the most powerful man in Egypt. I obey no one. My slaves are busy building my pyramids as well as my empire. I will never let his people go.
Well, let's see how God used Moses to free his people and made Pharaoh change his mind. One day, Moses saw a bush that had caught fire. As he watched it, it kept burning and burning and would not stop burning. When Moses took a closer look, God's voice spoke from the bush, saying, "I have seen how my people are suffering as slaves. Go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let them go." So Moses and Aaron traveled to Egypt and told Pharaoh that God said, "Let my people go." Pharaoh did not want to lose his slaves and said, "No." So God decided to send plagues on Egypt to show that he is the all-powerful God. He told Aaron to hold his staff over the river Nile, and all the water in the land became blood red. The fish died and the water stank. But Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. So God sent a plague of frogs. There were frogs jumping around everywhere. But Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. Next, God sent lots of small locusts called gnats to cover the land like dust. Even Pharaoh's magicians knew that this was something only God had the power to do. But Pharaoh still refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. So God sent a fourth plague, flies. Flies swarmed around Pharaoh's palace and the Egyptians, but not around the Hebrew slaves. But would he let the Hebrew slaves go? No. So God sent a plague on the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats belonging to the Egyptians. But the animals belonging to the Hebrew slaves were spared. But Pharaoh still refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. So next, God sent a plague of horrible festering boils that broke out on the skin of people and animals, but Pharaoh still refused to let the slaves go. Even when God sent the worst thunder and hailstorm Egypt had ever seen, Pharaoh would not let the Hebrews go. So God sent an east wind that brought in a plague of locusts that covered the ground and ate all the crops that were growing. But rather than obey God, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. Even when God put the Egyptians in darkness for 3 days while the Hebrew slaves had light, Pharaoh still refused to let the Hebrew slaves go. So God decided to send a last and terrible plague. At midnight, the firstborn son of every family would die. The same would happen to the cattle. But God told the Hebrews to sacrifice a lamb and paint its blood around their doors. All those living in houses covered by the blood would live. That night, the angel carrying out God's command passed over all the houses with the blood around the door. But there was weeping and wailing all over Egypt as the firstborn sons of all the Egyptians were found dead. At last, Pharaoh knew he did not have the power to keep saying no to God. He told Moses that the Hebrew slaves could be set free. And the Hebrew slaves were ready and waiting to leave. The Egyptians even gave them gifts to send them on their way. So they headed off to the land God had promised to give them.
Let's do a recap of the story we just read today. How many plagues did God send to Egypt? Awesome! 10 plagues! And what was the first plague? That's right, all the water turned blood red. Now what was the last plague? It's sad but true, all the 4 firstborn children died. And what did God have the Hebrews paint around their doors? That's correct, it was lamb's blood they used to paint around their doors. This week's scripture verse is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Now let's try repeating that after me, alright? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. That's the end of telling Moses and the 10 plagues, but make sure you tune in next week to hear about Moses parting the Red Sea. It's going to be an awesome one.